any parents watching this podcast or listening to this podcast is don't just focus on the grade. That will kill all creativity.
And welcome to the Haileybury Astana podcast. Today we're diving into the world of STEM education and exploring effective learning habits for our young scientists, engineers and mathematicians. To guide us, we have Tom Hill, our head of senior school and expert in STEM education. Let's get started. Hi Tom.
Hi Sasha.
Thanks for coming. Tom, my first question is, what do you think are the key habits that distinguish successful STEM pupils from others?
I think for me, one of the most important, it's a habit, is an attitude. I'm not quite sure what's the difference, to be honest. But for me, the most important thing for that field of study is about curiosity. You've got to have that innate desire to find out that little bit more, to ask that why question the whole time. So I think that's where everything begins in this field of study, trying to make sure that those young people, whether it's in our classrooms or outside, they're constantly trying to question things, trying to find out a little bit more. But it's not just about beginning with questioning. What we then have to have is a really solid process. Well, what do I do if I've got a question that I want answered, if there's a problem that needs to be solved? What they also need to have is a really solid process that then allows them to find the answer to that question. So it's not just enough to answer questions. What we've also got to do is have a process that then allows them to get a good answer out of it. And I think that second part of it for me is about the ability to think critically. And I think that word critically is also a really important one, because it's not just about randomly gathering information and trusting everything that comes to you. You have to be able to be discerning about the sorts of information that you look for, the sorts of things that you try to do to find that information as well. So thinking critically is quite a difficult thing to achieve, because it's on the foundation of a lot of other skills, in particular really being able to fully understand just the knowledge of your subject area. So particularly in science and technology and engineering and mathematics, there's a significant amount of knowledge that you need to have mastery of as well before you can even start to ask good questions and get good answers out of them. So you're thinking critically, you've got a curious mind, and then coming out of that, you have to have a process that's goal orientated. You have to have a plan. In order to really get a decent answer, you also have to have a really clear idea of, well, what is it that I'm now going to try and get out of answering this question? What am I actually trying to do? Now, the importance of having a plan and having goals is that then when you hit the go button on it and you start actually enacting your process, you then got to have an ability to evaluate. Once you've gone through that process and try to find that solution, try to find the answer to that question that you've asked, you then have to have an ability of evaluating and figuring out whether or not you've done that in an effective way. So being able to have that feedback loop is really important, really good quality feedback once you've gone through that process, to be able to know, well, what went well, what didn't quite go as well as it could have done. Can I rely on the information that I've generated, or is it something that is actually invalid for whatever reason? And having a really open mind about actually probably being more excited about finding out where things have gone wrong, because I think that growth mindset that we speak about so much, particularly in science and technology, engineering, mathematics, is so important, because more often than not, our students associate that field of study with concrete answers, with finite definitions of things. And actually, it's almost the opposite. They need to realize that the way in which science overall has been able to develop itself is actually by getting lots of things wrong, by not quite figuring something out properly and knowing what's wrong about that, and really being excited about finding out that next answer and that next bit that hasn't quite been looked at properly. You know, for instance, you take Isaac Newton, half of his theories have been disproved by modern physics. That doesn't mean that Isaac Newton was a bad scientist, does it? We all know that he was a great scientist. But what we know is that scientists that have then gone on after him have had that curiosity, but also that understanding that it's never complete, it's never all right. We always want to find out what's gone wrong. So I think they're some of the key habits and behaviors, that curiosity, goal-driven, and being able to have that real open growth mindset and using feedback to help feed you to become a better STEM student.
Yeah, that's completely right. I know that problem solving as a skill is becoming more and more popular. How do you think it's important in STEM education, and how can students improve it?
Well, like I mentioned in my previous answer there, I think it's really important that you begin with mastery of knowledge. Of course, we want to have that exploration. We want to have that freedom to find those new answers and to question. But students can only really evaluate when they have that foundation of knowledge. So in education, we talk about Bloom's taxonomy a lot. Whilst it's a theory that's been around for many, many decades, actually. But in all of my experience as an educator, it stood really solidly as something which I can see that progression through those steps of that taxonomy. So we begin with understanding, and then we build upon that, and then ultimately you build to analysis, and then you go to evaluation, and then that final, that sort of that top goal is about being creative. The very highest point of thinking is being creative, but it's based upon evaluating and analyzing, and you can only really do those things if you've got that foundation of understanding, that mastery of knowledge. So that is essential to problem solving. You can't solve problems well without knowing your stuff. So I'm afraid those of you that are interested in developing yourself as scientists and engineers and mathematicians, you've got to do the hard yards. You've got to know your theories. You've got to do the reading. You've got to engage with that. You have to have that. But know that it's not just for knowledge's sake in its own. It's there to give you that springboard. So I think for problem solving, for those of you that really want to be able to solve problems well, you have to have that strong theoretical underpinning. But then again, like I said, it's not just having that knowledge, because sometimes we have stereotypes of good scientists, don't we? That they are somehow these, and I hate this word, but nerds. Yeah, you've got these people that just want to obsess with things. But more often than not, if you think about the soft skills that go along with that stereotype, you also associate some things. A lack of ability to communicate, fairly isolated. Some of the and I think some of those things we have to realize that problem solving isn't usually an individual thing. Good problem solving often also happens by collaborating and being able to communicate. So if you've got all this knowledge, and if you've done that first part that I spoke about in terms of problem solving and having that mastery of knowledge, you've read all your books, you've done all your groundwork, so to speak. But if you can't then communicate that to somebody, then that knowledge just stays with you. It's not shared. It's not used in a practical way. So just having knowledge isn't enough. We then also have to have the communication skills that go along with that, the ability to articulate those things, the ability to engage other people, to listen to what they're saying, to be able to then speak to them articulately and in a way which has power and significance, and then also to work collaboratively. Yeah, because good problem solving isn't just about you finding the answer; it's about us finding the answer. And that one of the things that I'm really fascinated about is about that, what we call divergent thinking. So problem solving, and often, particularly nowadays with the advent of the internet and all of these things where lots of information is shared, what can also happen is lots of information just gets regurgitated. If we stay within the same frame of reference and we don't bring in new people, maybe from different cultures and from different walks of life, more often than not, when we come across the bigger problems, we tend to find what we call fairly homogenous problem solving. It all kind of gets solved in the same way.
Sure.
And diverse thinking and bringing in teams and being able to work with people from quite different fields, we often find, research tells us that the more divergent the team, the better and the more creative the solution. So problem solving it has that range of things that I believe students need to look at. And I think the thing that I'm really proud of here at Haileybury Astana is that when we think about teamwork, when we think about working with each other in terms of communication skills, they aren't just things that are done in the science lessons or the maths lessons. If anything, the sports teams, the music that we have, all of this holistic offer that we have is all about developing those soft skills, because we know that it's that combination of the hard theory, so to speak, alongside the soft skills that allows them then to go on to solve problems. So, I'm an educator that has always, my background has been English and sports science. I did both, an arts subject and a science. And I found that although some people often talk to me and say, well, how did those two things work together? You're reading Shakespeare and then you're going and, playing football over here, and that doesn't seem to coincide. But actually for me, it completely did, because it allowed me to do both of those things. And I think particularly one of the things that I found from that was that ability to work in teams to develop those problem-solving skills that are so important to STEM education.
Thank you, Tom. As a Haileybury Astana parent, I know that many students struggle with balancing theory and practical application. How do you think that they can strike this balance effectively?
Yeah, I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship. That's the way I see it. They feed off each other. That kind of hands-on work that they want to get and do, and then that theoretical. Just again, like I was talking about before, I think what you have to see is that they're not in opposition to each other. They're not pulling away from each other. They should feed each other. Now, I think one of the main ways in which we need to make sure that balance happens is actually to trust the teachers in the space. I think that they are the experts in the field in terms of balancing and sequencing when they're shifting from the theoretical into the practical and back into the theory, and seeing the way in which the two are interplaying with each other is a really important thing. So I would argue part of the solution to that issue, we're talking about problem solving, because it is something, that struggle between those two things is to work with their teachers, is to ensure that when they are shifting from that theory into practical, that they are seeing those links, that they are able at the right time, when they've done enough of the theory, to then go and really see it living in a practical space that they can then use. And often we find that the practical will reinforce the theory and help to add layers to that understanding. But then what we would hope is then with that critically inquiring mind is that then when they finish that bit of theoretical practical, there will always be another question that they'll springboard off into some more theoretical understanding, or they'll want to find out just that little bit more because maybe that element of that practical thing didn't quite solve. So I need to now go and find out a little bit more about that thing and go forward with that. So, but I do think that, the experts that are often there in the space are the ones that should have that overview, should be able to judge that. And it is, teaching is an art, not a science, I would say. And that will always be driven by the way in which they're seeing the engagement, because sometimes what you don't want to have is a practical situation where the lack of theoretical knowledge then makes that practical breakdown and you get that frustration. We want to avoid frustration if at all possible, and we want to have that smooth transition between the two. And I think, the experts in the space are the ones that should hopefully be able to really manage that symbiotic relationship, that balance for the students.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. What role do self-assessment and reflection play in effective learning for STEM students?
I think it is integral to that ability to develop that growth mindset, being open to those moments when things go wrong, whether it's the practical that doesn't go right, or whether it's that test that doesn't quite get the score that you wanted it to do. And I think self-assessment is such a crucial skill. Self-assessment, or the capacity to be reflective as an underlying skill. We're an IB school here. It's one of the learner profiles. It's one of the core 10 things that we value in students. And that skill of being reflective, the concept is easy. I need to think about myself and where my strengths and weaknesses are. The actual ability to do that accurately, and have the confidence to do that, that's where the challenge lies. Particularly with young people in that kind of 14 to 18-year-old space, when they are anxious about the outcomes of their exams. They want to do well, and more often than not, they'll want to rely on the expert in the room, the teacher, to say, well, can you just tell me what the right answer is, because I've got it wrong here. Yeah. And whilst we will always help, and we will always want to sort of offer that extra level of judgment, but ultimately we want them to be independent learners. We want them to be able to cope with those challenges themselves, because at some point they're not going to have a teacher holding their hand. They're not going to have somebody that's going to be there. So, that ability to self-assess, to be self-correcting as well, to know that it's okay to find faults, to enjoy that process as much as they can, and to see that that's what gives them strength. The ability to find your weaknesses is what gives you strength. And particularly the understanding that without that constant use of feedback, you're never really going to make anywhere near the progress that you can. So if you want to make progress, if you want to persevere into areas of knowledge and areas of thought that aren't that haven't quite been understood yet, you have to have that ability to understand yourself in real time. Technology is really good for that now. That real-time feedback, we thrive off getting it immediate, whether it's social media or any of these things. If you look at the way in which they work, it's by getting little and often feedback on whether or not we are, and obviously to do with posts that we put online or whatever it is, we're already really conditioned to have that sense of, have I done the right thing, or has somebody got an issue with that, or what have you. So having that inner voice, though, is such an important thing for STEM students in particular, because they're dealing with quite complex issues, and they just need to be confident enough, I would say, to find those spaces to work on.
This is such a good and encouraging answer, Tom, and it certainly gives us all food for thought. Speaking of technology, how do you think can STEM pupils leverage it to enhance their learning habits?
I think what we have to remember, there's a couple of things. There's the physical technology, which is sort of the capturing of data. So a lot of the work that we do in the field of science and technology and engineering and mathematics is driven by data. And technology can really help us to capture that data, first of all. So it could be the specific devices that we're using, or the sorts of things that we're trying to harness in terms of the actions of the real world around us. So that's the first thing. So technology can be really helpful in being able to do that. And then once we've captured that data in a way that's accurate and valid and reliable, what we then have to be able to do is to analyze it. And that's the second thing where technology can be really helpful now, where what we're seeing is that ability to, particularly when we talk about big data a lot, don't we? So the more and more we have the ability to capture lots of things, the more data we get, the more we need some help with being able to sort of process all of those numbers and those ideas to then turn it into themes and trends and conclusions that we can then start to work with and understand and analyze. So I think technology is good at capturing, technology is good at analyzing. That's one part of it. A second part of it for me, particularly when we're thinking more about the AI space, because I think lots of conversations now in technology tend to veer towards AI. And I think from my perspective, we have to realize that AI is driven by the information that is already out there. It is not created. It gives the illusion, in my humble opinion, it gives the illusion of creativity. But in reality, if you understand the way in which it works, it's an algorithm, it's a language-based model. And what it does is it takes the ideas that have already been posted online, that have already been captured by its database, and it just pulls them out and then puts them together for you and shows, here's lots of things. But remember, the important thing here, particularly when we're talking about science and technology, they're things that have already been created before. Science, technology, it's all about finding out new things. So we have to be really careful that we don't get fooled by AI into thinking that simply because I've asked a really careful, my prompt craft is really good, I've plugged it into an AI engine and it's generated this kind of thing that appears to me to be new, it will never be new. However, what I think it's really good at doing, particularly in terms of AI, is things like designing processes, so setting up models and frameworks, because if we know that scientists from the past they've just got standard methodologies that we know are tried and tested and are reliable, that's great. Please tell me about that. Give me a process, give me a model to use, but then let me use it in my own real time, away from the AI engine, so that I can then actually see what's going on. And there's the analogy. So what AI allows us to do is to stand on the shoulders of those giants to see further. But we are still the people that need to look and see what we're doing. We mustn't just look down into that space that the AI creates for us. We've got to realize that it's all things that have gone in the past, and we need to look in the future. So I think the AI technology space is about giving us some really interesting frameworks to work from. I think it does a lot of the legwork. It gets us to that point far more quickly without necessarily having to do as much of that. I mean, when I was at university and I was doing my science degree, I spent lots of time in the library, and finding the books and reading the theories, and, a lot of that work is done. And a little bit of me is a bit sad that maybe some students aren't doing that as much, because there's something quite, visceral and engaging about that. But, we're in a modern age and we're trying to prepare them for the world of the future. And we know that whatever profession they're going into, whether it's STEM related or not, they're going to have to be able to use this information tool, but ensuring that they always know that they have to add their humanity to it. They have to add their part on it. They have to take it that one step further, not just rely on it to just provide the information and then just go with what it says.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Tom. Getting back to the soft skills, we know that collaboration is a significant part of STEM fields. How can students develop effective teamwork skills?
Yeah, here at Haley Vistana and in a lot of schools, and from my own personal background, I went to a grammar school in the UK, a typical grammar school that had all sorts of things on the curriculum and outside of the curriculum. And my experience of that resulted in me, I didn't really realize it at the time. For instance, I played piano. And I can't say as a 15-year-old keen sportsman having to sort of sit down at the piano for half an hour every day and practice my pieces. There was times when maybe my resilience and my diligence in that was tested. But I think back on that time now, and I think about some of the skills that taught me and what it made me do, the confidence that it gave me when I then had to sit down in front of an examiner and play my grade 6 piece. But the confidence that then gave me, working off the back of the diligence that I had to approach in terms of the practice time that I had to put in, that gave me all sorts of skills that I then fed into the way in which I played rugby, the way in which I approached my reading of literature, and all of the things that I then did as a student actually benefited from that. And in terms of teamworking, it isn't just an activity that you do. Teamworking is a set of skills, teamworking begins with relationships. It begins with that core of connecting with people. And the way in which you connect with people is to communicate. And remember, communication is about speaking, like I'm doing now, and listening, which is what you're doing really well. And those things are all about being able to empathize with each other. And for me, the way in which there's so many different things that are available to young people now to be able to do that. So you have to practice that, and you have to challenge yourself. So the students engaging with all of the things that we have on offer here, particularly outside of the classroom, I would say they're the main spaces in which they can develop those team working skills. And also I would argue when we're in the classroom as well. Obviously I teach as well, and in my classes, more often than not, when you go to group work activities, students will always prefer to work with their friends. They'll always want to go, and that's fine, and you want them to feel comfortable. But I would also say to young people, when you have those opportunities in lessons and there are those group working activities, every once in a while, try to move beyond that friendship group, because in terms of team working skills, it's that you're not really developing that beyond a certain level. Just working with your friends and people that you get on with, okay, that's okay, and you might get a reasonable level of output there. But actually, to really develop that communication, teamwork skills, work with people you never worked with before. Work with people that you actually don't get on with that well, and see whether or not you can really engage in empathy, really know how to listen, really be able to test yourself in that space. And I think it's sometimes when we just push ourselves beyond that comfort zone, particularly when it comes to team working, because it is a personal interaction with people. It is a thing that you have to have a level of confidence in yourself with. But you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in terms of that communication piece, and when you're working in teams that maybe you don't always want to work with.
Thank you, Tom. How do you think can parents and teachers support the development of effective learning habits in STEM pupils?
The important thing that being a parent myself as well as a teacher is there's two key things: there's structure and there's consistency. Yeah, and that allows young people, because particularly students going through school, there's lots of changes. They often will shift the things that they like, the things that they don't like, the friends that they have, all of this change that is going on. And as teachers and as parents, we need to be the rock around which their sea bashes. We need to be that consistent thing. And I think being able to understand that structure, being clear about what the expectations are, it is an important sort of standpoint. So being really clear about your messaging, and from a teacher's perspective, having that clearly defined progression through a curriculum, identifying not just what we're going to do today, but why we're going to do it. Relevance and connectivity to the real world is such an important thing for young people. If they don't know why they're doing it, they're not really going to be that motivated to want to do it. So that's the first thing that I think is really important. And the second part is being absolutely wholeheartedly committed to a growth mindset. Okay? And particularly, and this would be my plea to any parents watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, is don't just focus on the grade. That will kill all creativity. That will reduce any kind of ability to make progress. If the only thing you focus on is my child got a B+, not an A, and that's going to create a negative energy. Yeah, you're in control of your response to that. Young people are in control of their response to that, and you have to show maturity and leadership as a parent and as a teacher. So when that growth mindset is, or if it's a B+ and not an A, great, that gives me some work on. Any test that you get 100% on, I would argue is a useless test because it hasn't told me anything. Mm-hmm. And I want to know where I need to go tomorrow to become better. If I just get 100% or an A star or whatever, or 10 out of 10, whatever the grade is, and if I get 99% or a B+, and then I believe that the world has ended because of that, and I feel that somehow my child is not developing to the level I want them to do, then you're not understanding the process. Yeah. So I think parents have to commit to that. They have to say, okay, you want to know, you want to be able to track progress. Don't get me wrong. So you need to know that number, but your reaction to that number, that's the important part of it. So as parents, you have to be able to say, just tell me what your work-ons are. Each time you get any kind of feedback, particularly through assessment, that sort of thing, what is your work on? Or have you got clarity? That's the most important thing, because we know as educators that when you look at the importance of feedback, it's a hugely important part of ensuring progress, ensuring that students are learning, whether it's in STEM or not. The problem that we sometimes find in those subject areas is that parents have a perception that it's all about finite knowledge, that mathematics is about getting 2 + 2, which equals 4, and if you've put 5, you're no good at maths. It's not. All that means is that you need to work on your addition skills and understand what annotation means, or whatever the issue may be. And simply because a finite answer hasn't been arrived to doesn't mean that the student doesn't have the potential to learn. So maintaining that growth mindset is such an important thing, I believe, for parents and for teachers as well, to ensure that curiosity is maintained, that attitude that we spoke about is kept alive, because very quickly students can go in themselves, and as soon as you lose that confidence, you lose that spark of curiosity, and as soon as you lose that spark of curiosity, it's very difficult to get any progress out of it.
Yeah, we certainly don't want them to lose the spark of curiosity. Thank you, Tom. My last question is actually the one I've always wanted to ask. What's your advice for STEM students dealing with burnout and loss of motivation?
I think the most important thing for that, we understand that well-being is such an important part of our approach here at Haley Astana. Again, it connects to that holistic model. It connects to all of the things that we do. Burnout is feedback like anything else. Yeah, and we need to see it as that. We need to not see it as a failing. We need to see it as a way of, whether it's our psychological state or our mind or our body, just telling us, hang on a second, something isn't quite right here. Yeah, and we need to have an open mind to it. It's not a point of failure. It's not a point of weakness. It's just feedback like anything else. It's just something saying we maybe need to pause here, and we need to think about how we're getting on with things. So that's the first thing. So having that growth mindset, that understanding that if anything goes wrong, that's just an opportunity to pause. And I would say burnout is an indicator of something having gone wrong in your process. Yep, something not quite working. And usually it can be a number of things, but one area it can be, do you have effective goals? Yeah. Are the goals that you have set for yourself, are they realistic? Are they attainable? Are they things that can that connect to who you are as a person, and what your longer term sort of aspirations are? So we do a lot of this with young people, where they may have aspirations to get into an Ivy League university, yeah, for instance, and sometimes they they connect with that goal, and then they believe that in year 7, because I want to get into Ivy League, but because in year 7 I just got a 9 out of 10 in my maths test, that means that I'm not going to get to Harvard. It's like, no, and if your process is that no, hang on a second, we need to break this down again. So if your goals are far too I'm not talking about aspirational, but if they've not been broken down into clearer steps, well, hang on a second, if all you're obsessing is about what's going to happen in 5 years' time, and you're not obsessing about what's reasonable to happen next week or next month, there's a part of process there that you need to look at. So pause and think about your goals. Are actually your goals which are driving that psychology, are driving that sense of well-being? And often they are, isn't it? If I feel like I've not achieved a goal, that will often have an impact on you emotionally, and then ultimately that will likely lead to you burning out and feeling like, well, I'm not getting anywhere. That ultimate feeling of burnout is often one that I feel things are out of control, and no matter how much work I put in, I'm not getting to the point that I want to be. Well, hang on a second. Actually, what is it that you did yesterday that made you think that? What is it that happened there? What evidence are you using to base your perception of progress on? So that's a really important thing. So you go back to process, you look at the goals that you're setting, and more often than not, particularly when I talk to young people who are experiencing this, it's just about saying, hang on a second, let's achieve some perspective on where our goals are here. It's not to worry too much about that future goal, which seems to be the thing that's really playing on your mind. Let's just think about tomorrow, or let's think about next week. So breaking things down and saying, okay, let's just pause, because what we want to have is that positive feedback loop starting to come in and to feed that sense of nourishment, to feed that sense of well-being. And more often, if we can just break it down into smaller steps, that's a really important thing that can help with burnout. Just pause. Let's just break it down. Let's feel control again over our workload. And then the second part of that is, and this is, you asked me about parents earlier, and I think that's, and again, it all fits in that kind of feedback space as well. I think if you're feeling burnt out, one of the key strategies is having some form of mentorship there as well. And the best mentors are the ones that are objective, okay? And I'm sorry to say this, parents, and I can say this because I'm a parent as well. Sometimes your parents aren't always necessarily your best mentors. Why? Because inevitably you are subjective.
Yes, we are.
I've got 3 children, and I can honestly say, hand on heart, I'm a parent and I'm an educator. Have I been completely objective with some of the expectations and the goals that I've set for my 3 children? No, because you can't pull yourself away. You're connected to them. So young people need to have that other, and we talk about it a lot in educational theory, you need to have that other significant adult in your life. We know the most successful young people have been able to identify an other important adult in their lives that can, again, help to give them perspective. And like I say, that mentorship, usually it's a teacher, sometimes it can be an older student, sometimes it can be it can be anybody in the space in which they're learning, or outside, that just is able to give them that sense of objective advice that creates perspective, which allows them to then realize, hang on a second, am I being realistic with my goals? Am I being able to then set reasonable targets for myself that are manageable in terms of my energy and my workload? And part of that is making sure that we are generating balance, because more often than not, what a good mentor should do is sort of say, well, how are you? Yes, you're working hard on your studies, but to what extent are you giving yourself a break? To what extent are you playing that sport that you always loved, playing that musical instrument, enjoying that pastime? Particularly we find that the closer that our students get towards their high stakes examinations when they're looking to university, that more often than not, they'll tend to jettison those things. I'm not going to play that sport anymore. I'm not going to practice that instrument. I'm not going to do any of those things. Hang on a second. Those things are helping you get your grades. Don't think that they're getting in the way of that, because if it's that ability to pause and give yourself thinking space, to switch off, to reset, to recharge your batteries, all of those things. But more often than not, students, when they're stuck in the middle of that whirlpool of wanting to get grades, of needing to get that entry-level requirement for university, they'll make some of those decisions that somebody from outside will look in and go, hang on a second, are you sure? Go for a walk. do that thing, go and play a game of football, whatever it is that keeps you happy. And even half an hour of that will then feed back in and will still allow you to achieve that goal. So I think that there would be my key parts of advice on avoiding burnout. Think about your process, seek advice from mentors that are objective, and give yourself a break.
Thank you so much, Tom, for those insightful answers and for actually setting the pathway for our future episodes. And that's all for today's episode, I think. Stay tuned for more tips on STEM education. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe and share to stay updated on future discussions. And I'll see you next time.
Bye.